So you're trying to get a handle on the forces shaping our world.
Yeah.
Trying to cut through all the noise and understand how nations that seem aligned are actually, well, operating. We see the headlines all the time: China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, often painted as this, united front against the West.
Right. That's the common narrative.
But let's unpack that a bit, because what our look at the source material shows is something much more complex, maybe even manipulative going on.
Exactly. That idea of a solid anti-Western alliance, it's easy to see why people think that, given the shared opposition they sometimes voice.
Sure.
But when you dig into their actual actions, especially, say, at the UN or how they're interacting now with the Ukraine war, it paints a really different picture, much more self-interested.
Okay, so that's our mission for this deep dive then.
Yeah.
To get past those surface-level statements, the solidarity talk.
Yeah.
We want to look at how these four countries have interacted historically and now, and figure out, is this a real alliance, genuine support, or is it, something more calculated?
Let's start right there with that idea of the solid block, because the patterns we see, they really suggest a pretty significant gap between that perception and reality.
Okay, how so? Where do we see that divergence most clearly?
Well, a really telling place is the UN Security Council. Their voting records, the strategic moves they make there, it's quite revealing.
Interesting. Okay, so Iran, often mentioned as a key part of this group, right?
Definitely.
But the info we looked at highlights UN Security Council Resolution 1929 back in 2010. What happened there that sort of challenges this unity idea?
Right, 1929, that was a big one. It aimed to pressure Iran over its nuclear program, imposed really significant sanctions, hit their economy, their arms trade.
Okay. And the surprising part?
The surprising part, or maybe not so surprising if you look closely, is that both China and Russia voted for it.
Both of them.
Wow.
The country's often seen as Iran's biggest backers on the council.
Exactly. It really shows a core principle, doesn't it? National interest often trumps that ideological alignment we hear so much about. It cuts through the anti-Western rhetoric.
Yeah, that really lands differently. Iran must have expected, or at least really hoped, that Moscow and Beijing would use their veto power.
You'd think so, to block something that damaging. From Tehran's point of view, it could definitely feel like they got left out to dry. A strategic miscalculation, maybe, or worse.
Undermines that whole image of a united front.
Completely. And when you look at the wider context back then, it seems like for both China and Russia, their own goals, especially how they were engaging with the West at that moment, that took priority over sticking their necks out for Iran.
So the motivation wasn't really about stopping Iran's nuclear program together, but more about positioning, using their vote.
That seems to be a big part of it. The analysis suggests they used votes like this almost like bargaining chips with the West.
How would that work? Bargaining chips.
Well, by voting for these sanctions, they could present themselves as, responsible global players.
Yeah.
Committed to non-proliferation, all that.
Right. Look good on the world stage.
And then maybe use that image, that perceived cooperation, to ask for something else from Western countries. Concessions on trade, maybe diplomatic support on another issue, or just generally boosting their own standing.
So it's calculated, prioritizing their own gain, even if it meant throwing a supposed partner under the bus, so to speak.
It paints a picture of a very transactional relationship, yeah. Not one built on deep, shared values or goals.
And you mentioned this wasn't just about Iran. North Korea faced something similar at the UN.
Oh, definitely. North Korea's nuclear tests, they also led to a whole series of UN Security Council resolutions imposing sanctions.
Right.
And again, what's really striking is that between roughly 2006 and 2017, China and Russia repeatedly either voted for these sanctions or, crucially, didn't veto them.
They let them pass.
They let them pass. Resolutions like 1718, 1874, 2094. These directly helped isolate North Korea economically and diplomatically.
So again, these are countries we group together as anti-West, yet China and Russia actively helped put the squeeze on North Korea.
Exactly. Now, later on, they did start voicing concerns about, U.S. pressure and the humanitarian impact. But that initial support or lack of opposition for those key resolutions, that's really important for understanding their strategy.
It highlights that pattern again, doesn't it? Prioritizing their own position, their own strategic calculations, even if it meant contributing to the isolation of someone supposedly on their side.
Precisely. It forces you to ask, right? If these were truly solid alliances, why would they keep voting for measures designed to basically cripple their partners?
It definitely makes you rethink the whole nature of these connections. Okay, let's shift gears a bit to the present day. The war in Ukraine, Western sanctions on Russia. That's obviously changed the landscape.
Hmm.
How are Russia, Iran, and North Korea interacting now? Does it fit this pattern?
Well, this is where you see the practical results of that underlying dynamic we've been talking about. Russia, facing serious sanctions, cut off from Western tech and finance.
Yeah, need supplies.
Exactly. So it's turned increasingly to Iran for drones and reportedly looking to North Korea for artillery shells, ammunition.
So they're leaning on these other sanctioned states out of necessity.
It really underscores the situation Russia finds itself in. It's not necessarily a sign of a strengthening deep friendship. It's more like Russia is, well, weaponizing the pariah status of Iran and North Korea because it has few other options.
Leveraging their isolation to get what it needs for the war.
That sums it up pretty well. It's transactional, born out of mutual or maybe overlapping desperation and isolation.
Yeah.
It's not really proof of some powerful unified bloc acting in concert.
Interesting. And China's role in all this. They seem a bit more detached, watching from the sidelines, perhaps.
China seems to be playing a longer game here, strategically speaking. By letting Iran and North Korea become more visible in their support for Russia, supplying drones, ammo, etc., China kind of lets them draw the West's attention, the scrutiny, the potential secondary sanctions. It acts as a bit of a lightning rod.
So it keeps the focus off Beijing to some extent.
It helps, yeah. It allows China to maintain a degree of plausible deniability, keep its global trade going with fewer direct hits. It benefits from that diffusion of Western pressure.
It really does sound like a very asymmetric relationship. China and, to some extent, Russia holding more cards, offering just enough support to Iran and North Korea to be useful, but keeping them constrained.
Exactly. Which brings us to this idea of a divide and conquer strategy.
Okay, explain that. How might China and Russia be using that kind of tactic here?
Well, the thinking is that it's a calculated approach by Moscow and Beijing to make sure neither Iran nor North Korea gets too strong, too independent, or becomes a real peer competitor or even a major liability.
How do they do that?
The diplomatic isolation we talked about, those UN votes, that's one tool. It keeps them dependent, needing Russia and China.
Okay, makes sense. And the support they do offer, like the drones from Iran, the ammo from North Korea.
That's the other side of it. Offer selective, limited alignment. Just enough to get what they need. Weapons, resources, maybe some diplomatic cover, but without making deep, binding commitments. It keeps Iran and North Korea useful, but ultimately expendable.
So they get access without treating them as equals.
Pretty much. And it also keeps them somewhat isolated from each other, potentially. Less chance of a truly united front emerging that Beijing or Moscow couldn't control.
It's almost like they use the unpredictability of Iran and North Korea itself as a tool.
That's a good way to put it. Controlled instability. By letting them engage in certain provocative actions, maybe China and Russia can create background noise, exert indirect pressure on the West.
Create problems that maybe Moscow or Beijing can then offer to help manage.
Exactly. It enhances their own perceived influence, their indispensability, without them having to take the direct risks. And crucially, as you said, it hinders any real solid unity forming among these other states. Each one stays somewhat reliant on the big players.
Okay, so pulling it all together then. The main takeaway here seems to be that this whole idea of a tight-knit China, Russia, Iran, North Korea alliance, it's probably more myth than reality.
Based on the evidence, yes. It looks much more like a system of strategic exploitation, maybe manipulation, driven primarily by China's and Russia's own national interests.
And the UN votes, the way things are playing out around the Ukraine war, those are pretty stark examples of this dynamic.
Absolutely. It really forces us to look past the rhetoric, past the headlines about a new axis, and analyze the actual behavior. It's far more complex and, frankly, self-serving than the simple narrative suggests.
This analysis really makes you think, doesn't it, about how we understand global power dynamics more broadly. If what looks like a strong bloc on the surface is actually, well, a group being managed and sometimes even undermined by its most powerful members, what does that tell us about international stability?
It really raises a fundamental question for you, the listener, doesn't it? Could the perceived strength of any international bloc really be something of an illusion? Maybe built more on just a temporary overlap of self-interests, rather than any deep, lasting solidarity. It certainly makes you wonder what other alliances that seem solid might actually deserve a closer, perhaps more skeptical look.